Deuteronomy 4 and 5. It's interesting in chapter 4 that the writer does what most writers would never dream of doing, and that is they tell us the whole story, the big story, ahead of time. God will become angry with his people, 4:25. He will scatter the people, 4:27. They will serve other gods, 4:28, which will be made of wood and stone, it says. And then in 4:30, yet these people, God's people, will someday return. So that's the whole story really in 5 or 6 verses that will be much of the Old Testament narrative. What I want to mention at the end of this discussion is a very common, I think, misconception when you, and this is one of the examples that causes the misconception, when the writer, Moses, talks about worshiping other gods, and then he says, and he adds this idea that are made of wood and stone. Many of us have probably grown up with the idea, and many writers still will say this, that means that these gods, the gods they're serving, are actually made up or just man-made. In fact, here's a sample statement I just ran across the other day. Note the stark distinction between the one and only true God and human representations of false gods. For Israel to acknowledge and worship these imaginary deities would be corrupting. In fact, they even mention that verse, Deuteronomy 4, at this point, and would result in Israel's demise. Well, what do we do about that? Because, again, that's a very common idea, that because these gods here are equated with the idol, that somehow they don't exist. Well, let's think about that, because here's what's going on. Again, in the culture of the ancient Near East, they had a very close relationship in their minds, in the average world, or the world of the ancients, that this deity here could be, in a sense, could come into an object. And there's a long process that these nations would go through to take an idol to a priest, a local village priest, and he would keep it overnight, and he would invite the god into the object, and so forth. It's a very elaborate ceremony. So that when you took that object home the next day, you veritably thought of it as your god. Now, if you lost it, or if it burned or something, you made another one. So you were able to divide between the spirit and the object, but that object also transubstantiated the deity. It actually housed it in some sense in their mind. So be always ready for the biblical writer to both warn people of the danger of the real deity and yet to mock the idea. And this will happen in numerous later texts. You know, you carve wood to make a god, and then you use the shavings of the wood to make your dinner. You know, and that's just kind of a stupid idea, right? It just doesn't make sense. But and the writers will realize that. But they're always going to differentiate between the reality and the man and the man-made. And I think we always need to keep that in mind. Well, what about that idea of false gods? You will see that term actually in some translations. I looked it up today. In numerous versions, you'll even see the phrase false gods. The problem with that's just a mistranslation, because the Hebrew term behind false, shaker, that's a Q. Shaker means to lie or deceive. So you notice it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means it lies to you. And if anything will be true about these deities, they will lie to those who worship them. What about this phrase, and it does occur, not gods? That's in Jeremiah 5:7. They worship spirits who are not gods. Sounds like they don't exist. Well, again, think in terms of comparison. Deuteronomy 32:21 says they are not a people. He uses the same language, not being the word lo in Hebrew. Lo Elohim, lo Am, not a people. Well, the people he's talking about are real, they exist, but by comparison to other peoples, other nations, they're much weaker. That's the point here. When we start to compare this deity with this deity, you might as well say they're not gods. There is no comparison in the sense of creator, created. So that's true, and that will be part of this larger discussion. But and one more thing that I think I've always wondered about this: how could God get so upset with people who just make up something in their heads? I've always wondered about that, and that's why I think the biblical text argues again for the reality of these gods. Let's use the illustration of a spouse that is thinking that their mate is being unfaithful, and they take the telephone at one point and try to catch the person that their spouse is talking to. If they hear a dial tone, if it's simply an imaginary being, you're not angry, you're sad. And that's why I think this is so carefully written out for us in Deuteronomy, upcoming discussions in Deuteronomy. This is not something that people make up. God is not upset about imaginary beings. He's upset about real beings. And so be watching for that conversation, which will recur now throughout Deuteronomy.